Hello and welcome to the Pacific Center podcast. My name is Dr. Greg Lane and I will be your host as we explore many interesting topics with many amazing people from a variety of professional backgrounds over the months and years ahead. The focus of this podcast will be the intersection of the traditional healthcare practices of various cultures and the modern scientific research on peak physical and cognitive performance. The show will be delivered in an interview format. Quick disclaimer, while we may be discussing some health-related issues and therapies, in no way will things be construed as medical advice. As always, if you are seeking information or treatment for a medical condition, please consult with a licensed healthcare provider. So our guest today is Eric Brand. Eric is a graduate of the Pacific College of Oriental Medicine and a fluent Chinese speaker. Eric has pursued extensive academic and clinical opportunities in mainland China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Following a prolonged internship at Changgung Memorial Hospital in Taiwan, Eric became immersed in numerous projects related to Chinese medical translation and herbal research. He is the author of A Clinician's Guide to the Use of Granule Extracts and the co-author of the text Concise Chinese Materia Medica, and he has edited a variety of modern and classical texts. Eric has a particular passion for Chinese herbal processing, we'll edit that. Eric has a particular passion for Chinese herbal processing, herbal authentication, and quality discernment. He serves as a TCM advisor to the American Herbal Pharmacopoeia and is a U.S. delegate for the ISO Technical Committee on TCM Standards. We're going to be speaking with Eric from his home office in Boulder, Colorado. Eric, welcome. It's so great to see you virtually and have you here. It's been a while since I've seen you. We had a nice lunch here the last time you were in San Diego. We're in for a real treat today to pick your brain on something that I know you're extremely passionate about. Before I begin, I want to read this brief passage from the classic Chinese medical text, the Neijing Su Wen, that will springboard us nicely into our discussion of the vast and fascinating subject of herbal medicine. Those who strive to go beyond normal human limits will remain light and strong, and although they grow old in years, they will remain able-bodied and flourishing. So Eric, take us back, if you will, to the first known uses of herbs in China and in India and ancient Greece and Western travelers and, like Marco Polo and the like. Or just kick us off here, buddy.
Well, that's a very big and broad topic, but the roots of herbal medicine in all cultures go back for thousands of years. So many of the early formative texts in Chinese medicine emerged around the same time, actually, as some of the early Greek texts of herbal medicine. And so you have actually a lot of interaction between China and the Arabic world, within South Asia, as well as within Europe. So throughout the history of Chinese medicine, there's been a long assimilation of new Chinese herbal medicine, new herbal medicines, new ideas, new concepts, and then a lot of transport of herbal medicines along the Silk Road, going across Central Asia to connect the East with Europe, as well as after the Age of Exploration, you had a lot of further development of what they call the Maritime Silk Road, where basically the trade of spices, herbal medicines, exotic materials from Southeast Asia and India by sea, traveling through China. So China has a very long history of absorbing foreign medicines. In terms of its earliest recorded knowledge, essentially it starts with a myth of Shen Nong. Yeah. And the first Materia Medica text in Chinese medicine that largely survived to the present day is the text, the Shen Nong Ben Cao Jing. Shen Nong Ben Cao Jing is ascribed to this mythological figure, Shen Nong. Shen Nong, according to the myth of Shen Nong, he tasted many different herbs, discerned which items were poisons, which items were medicines, which items were food. He's sort of a mythical figure that sort of honors the countless people that died in the experimentation for what is food, what is medicine. He's sort of a figure of sort of regarded as the mythological founder of Chinese agriculture, animal husbandry, and herbal medicine. And sort of the myth of Shen Nong is that one day, while trying to discern which items were food, which items were medicine, he ingested a poisonous substance and died. This myth largely kind of in a sense, thanks all of the countless unnamed ancestors that came before as human society developed and people learned which things were edible, which were poisonous in their own regional areas. And from the Shenong Bencao Jing, you basically had a long history of Materia Medica texts where original knowledge was often supplemented or added to. Around the 5th century, you had Tao Hongjing's work that was an annotated addition to the Shenong Bencao Jing. The original Shenong Bencao Jing contained 365 medicinals, and Tao Hongjing made further additions to it and further commentary on it. And he sort of established a pattern of scholarship that was exemplified throughout the later Chinese literature, where the original texts, the knowledge that had come before that was being transcribed in this book was written with one color ink, and then his own annotations were written with a different colored ink. And as printing developed, they maintained that difference by using different type sizes. And so Chinese medicine accumulated a long history of scholarship where it would preserve the previous works that came before it while adding new ideas, adding new comments, clarifying confusion. And that really reached a pinnacle in the Ming Dynasty with Li Shizhen, the author of Bencao Gangmu. Bencao Gangmu had 1,892 substances. It was sort of using Materia Medica, Chinese medicine theory, as a lens to classify the natural world as a whole. Li Shizhen made a sort of a novel classification system of all different items throughout nature, and he used the Chinese medicine theory to evaluate those substances. And so he kind of embodied that classical scholarship while also incorporating field research. And Li Shizhen not only combined traveling in the field, acquiring new knowledge, and reading the classical texts, but Li Shizhen was very much a critical thinker and reevaluated material that came before him, was constantly trying to make corrections and improvements. And Li Shizhen was a Renaissance figure. In fact, this is the 500th anniversary of Li Shizhen's birth. This year, there's a very large celebration in his hometown in China coming up on May 26th to celebrate him. But in Europe, what was going on around the same time period was a flourishing of herbal medicine texts started to happen also in the Renaissance period. Before the Renaissance, actually, much of herbal medicine knowledge in Europe was very closely rooted in Dioscorides, which was one of the earliest fundamental Greek texts around 2,000 years ago, a similar time period as like the Shenong Bencao Jing and the Hongdian Jing of Chinese medicine. And the Dioscorides was sort of a constant, stable text that was extensively used throughout early European herbal medicine. And then during the Middle Ages, European herbal medicine sort of fell into a period of time that was affected by the Dark Ages. A lot of European knowledge ended up being preserved in the Arabic world and then brought back from the Arabic world back into Europe. And around the Renaissance period, you started having different authors using languages other than Latin, using what were considered at the time the vulgar languages, German, English, the common spoken languages of the people to record herbal medicine knowledge. And that started to produce a big flourishing in the Renaissance. So from pretty much the Renaissance period of time afterwards, the Materia Medica literature in both cultures was quite developed. And there was a lot of exchange of medicinal materials between the cultures.
And you also had the third pillar, I guess, which would have been India, or was that included in what you just said?
Well, historically, a lot of the trade between India and Europe was linked through Arabic traders.
Okay.
And in a similar situation, the Arabic traders were also a key link between the trade between China and Europe. And so the Silk Road trade incorporated to some degree both Indian goods as well as Chinese goods. But the Silk Road was especially like a route of trade between China across to the Middle East. India and China directly, they had, even though they're very close geographically, historically the Himalayas were a very significant barrier. So when you think about when Buddhism went from India to China, one of the first people in the Tang Dynasty to bring a lot of those original fundamental Indian sutras over from India to China. It took him 27 years to make the journey. And it was a very difficult journey to cross the Himalayas directly. So a lot of the items from India entered Chinese medicine via sea.
Mm.
So a lot of the things that we see in Chinese medicine, some of the things that were traditionally called like a guang, for example, guang muxiang, the muxiang, Aucklandia or Sasaria, was traditionally a medicine that came from India and was imported from India into China via sea. And so the Chinese called it guang muxiang because it came from the southern trading hub of Guangzhou. Nowadays, when we talk about muxiang, we call it yun muxiang because that plant was successfully cultivated in Yunnan province in China, and now Yunnan province is the major production area for muxiang. But you have many examples of items that definitely traveled from India to China, and there was definitely an exchange of medical ideas, but oftentimes you find that in India, they think a lot of exchange of medical ideas from India to China. In China, they think a lot of exchange of medical ideas China to India.
Yeah.
It's basically, I think, both cultures were constantly interacting, and from an early time, but only with a relatively small number of individuals that actually made the journey.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting that I'm just listening to you talk about the different regions and thinking about, the development of the cultural herbal medicines of, like Ayurveda or Chinese medicine or like the South American herbs and how these all develop and get shared, over time. And that kind of brings us, to where we are today. You see this cross sharing of herbal medicines. And, I want to kind of get to that later, how, in peak performance, how we're seeing these being utilized, with athletes and, people that are just trying to enhance their lives or live longer. And that kind of brings me to the next question I have for you, talking about the different classes of herbs. And maybe, before we even depart into that, it's difficult to springboard forth without really talking about ginseng. And, because I think most of the public knows of ginseng as being like this amazing herb. And we know it in Chinese medicine for having multiple uses, but it was really, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the history of renshen, hong renshen, bai renshen, the different kinds of renshen, ginseng, and how they were used, and what is it myth? Is it fact? I mean, we know as practitioners what they do therapeutically, but maybe share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the question of ginseng is a very good question. Ginseng has an extremely rich cultural history behind it, and so one of the first things that we can say about ginseng is it touches a lot on the issue of natural resources. Historically, most ginseng was wild ginseng in early formative period of Chinese medicine. And wild ginseng grows extremely slowly. And in fact, one of the ancient names for renshen, the character for the shen that we use in renshen, this is a word generally ascribed to like medicinal roots, in ginseng in particular. That original character was in the bronze script was sort of a pictograph that illustrated the fruit and the root of the ginseng. But in early texts, we find mention that the ginseng from a region that no longer produces ginseng in modern day, called Shandong.
Okay.
A region that was cited in Tao Hongjin's 6th century work. He said that the best ginseng comes from this region in what's now modern day Shanxi province. So this Shandong region, modern day Changzhi of Shanxi, this area no longer has any ginseng growing there. But it was at one time, you could tell from the historical literature, you have botanical illustrations of the ginseng plant that clearly indicate that it was growing in that part of China. And the character Shen, besides for being a pictograph of the ginseng plant itself, one of the alternate characters used for ginseng was a word that also pronounced Shen, but means very slow growing. The ren in the character ginseng means human, and that's because it said that the root had a human-like shape. And so you can find ginseng roots with a remarkable similarity to the human shape. They're extremely, extremely rare to find the wild Chinese ginseng roots with a human shape anymore. To find any genuine wild ginseng at all is extremely rare. Wild ginseng would have probably gone extinct in the wild in the past, had it not been for about a 200-year period of time where the the Chinese emperors cut off access to the ancestral homeland of like the natural territory of ginseng was regarded as their ancestral homeland. The Qing emperors came from Manchuria. And actually the fall of the Ming dynasty and the rise of the Qing dynasty itself was somewhat related to ginseng, because the people that from the Manchurians who became the rulers in the Qing dynasty accumulated a tremendous amount of wealth from selling the wild ginseng to the Ming aristocrats. And that was actually a factor in allowing them to have the power to overtake the entire empire of China. And it was also, ginseng collection was also a factor in like the delineation between China and what's now North Korea, because the area right between China and North Korea around Changbai Mountain was a sacred homeland to the Manchurian people. And during the Qing dynasty, for about 200 years, that area was cut off from the common people. So you would be executed if you went in to harvest ginseng there. Wow. And the region that basically marked that execution line ended up influencing what became the border between China and Korea.
Amazing.
And so there was a long time where only the emperor's troops were allowed to go hunt for wild ginseng. And at that point in time, by the Qing dynasty, the area for wild ginseng had pretty much shrunken to only being that area around Changbai Mountain, in northeastern China, close to the Korean border. But from the textual evidence, the early botanical illustrations, we can see that actually ginseng existed on a larger geographic region, all the way from the ancient region that was called Shandong over to what they called at the time Liaodong, the northeastern part of China that encompasses Manchuria, and then over into Siberia. And so originally ginseng had a somewhat broader geographic range, but in the Bencao Gangmu, Li Shuzhen reports that the ginseng, due to overcollection and environmental damage, had already gone extinct in the Shandong region by the time he was writing about 500 years ago.
Wow.
The ginseng, in a way, it tells us a lot of history about the need to preserve natural resources. And it also illustrates the evolution of Chinese medicine from primarily relying on wildcrafted materials in the early stage to often utilizing cultivation of materials for sustainable supply in the modern era.
Yeah.
And the issue you mentioned, Hongshen and Bairenshen, and part of that story really kind of begins in Korea. It's thought that the cultivation of ginseng originally started to advance in Korea early on around the Song dynasty. You had periods of time where Korea and China had a relationship where Korea was required to give tribute, and one of the tribute items that was required to prevent war was ginseng. And so there was a lot of pressure on Korea to meet its quotas for ginseng production. And as the wild ginseng reserves started to become more depleted, people started to cultivate the roots, transplant the immature roots into cultivation and cultivate it. And the development of Hongshen, the red processed form of ginseng, what we call red ginseng instead of white ginseng.
Yeah.
The development of Hongshen actually came about originally as a preservation method to prevent damage from insects and mold as the ginseng was shipped from Korea to China. And so Hongshen actually started off as a preservation technique.
Wow.
And during my PhD research, one of the things I was looking at was the historical changes in Chinese medicines. And one of the items that we looked at was ginseng. We had a really rich collection that had been preserved in London of specimens of ginseng over the last 200 years or so. They had over 50 different specimens, and you could see ginseng preparations from Japan, from Korea, from China, white ginseng, red ginseng, and dongyangshen, which is a Japanese processing method of ginseng where they're using parboiling of the root. You could see basically the same preparation methods that we use for ginseng today were already in use in the late 1800s, and the root material of the late 1800s is remarkably similar to the cultivated root material that we have today. Yes, the main difference now is that you start to have, in addition to normal field cultivation, now you start to have a little bit more extensive practice of people doing half-wild cultivation, where they're trying to grow ginseng in a wild simulated environment as well.
Are they in the Shanxi province or the Shandong province where it was first grown? Or because I know they're trying to grow it in America too. And actually, can you speak a little bit to that? Obviously we know that the regions where the medicinal substances are grown play a big part in their therapeutic values, right, and their active
Mhm.
constituents.
Well, I think that if you were going to look at ginseng and compare, look at the feasibility of growing ginseng in different ecosystems,
Mm-hmm.
then on the one hand, you have some evidence that it's difficult to grow good ginseng in different environments. For example, you had some early experiments in the 1970s in China where they tried to grow ginseng in southern China.
Uh-huh.
And the root would grow and it would get very large and fat, but it was almost like a turnip. It had very little flavor or potency and virtually no medicinal value. So people discontinued it.
No body, no head. Just
Yeah,
just
it's
the root.
basically just turned into like a big radish. It looked
Interesting.
big and fat, but it was just full of sugar
Water or
and
something.
starch, not much sap in it.
Starch. Huh. Interesting.
That said, they have some researchers have reported that they've been able to get good ginsenoside yields off growing ginseng hydroponically. So there may be totally different ways that ginseng can be grown than people have done it in the past that haven't yet been systematically researched. But
that would make sense.
But you could definitely look at American ginseng as a good example of one where the plant was successfully transplanted out of its original ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
But also American ginseng shows a little bit of the imperfections in that. So if you look at the original homeland of American ginseng, mostly in the cold parts of the eastern US and Canada,
Mm-hmm.
Mostly in the east. But ginseng has now been American ginseng has been successfully cultivated on the west side, in Washington and in British Columbia.
Okay.
The material grown in British Columbia compared to the material grown in Ontario are still a little bit different macroscopically.
Mm-hmm.
And then American ginseng also been successfully cultivated in China, both in northeastern China as well as in northern China in the area around Beijing.
Mm-hmm.
And the area around Beijing actually produces slightly higher quality typically than the area around the northeast. So even within China, you can find certain regions that seem to be more suited to it.
Yeah.
But there's definitely good quality American ginseng that has been successfully grown in China. So in the past, you would be able to sort of clearly identify the American ginseng grown in Canada or Wisconsin from that grown in China.
Mm-hmm.
But the gap in quality is getting closer and closer as the cultivation technique advances. So I think it's largely a question of, people used to think you would never be able to grow good wine outside of the old European production regions.
Right.
Places like Napa have demonstrated that if you have the right varieties, the right techniques, the right environment, you can't say geography doesn't matter because Napa is better than San Diego when it comes to wine.
Yeah.
You couldn't say that the skill and the art can still be successfully adapted.
Yeah. Even down in Baja California, there's this Valle de Guadalupe, which is this little temperate valley that grows incredible wines. But anyway, so we've learned a bit about ginseng, and I think that for our listeners that was a really great historical context, and I'm curious now about. And I'm sure our listeners will be curious about the other herbs and varieties in this category. What would you call this category? Emperor herbs, or we have a traditional name for the strata of herbs, right? So, what are some other emperor type herbs?
Well,
or herbs that
if we think about sort of tonics in general, I think maybe. When you think of like superior, middle, and inferior herbs, it kind of brings to mind this three-tiered classification system of the Shenong Bensao Jing, which in some cases, holds true in the modern day. In some cases, you have some herbs that are extensively used that would be in a lower position, Shenong Bensao, and then others that are in a high position, Shenong Bensao, but not that extensively used today. So, but if we think about what are the most important tonics in Chinese medicine, then certainly, of course, ginseng is one of the first ones that comes to mind. Another one would be astragalus.
Okay.
Astragalus is also an item that has a kind of an interesting side story. Since a lot of your listeners are Chinese medicine practitioners, a lot of them may already be familiar with the basic Chinese medicine actions of astragalus. Many people that are probably listening from the general public are familiar with astragalus for its effects on the immune system and other modern research that's been done on it. But it's an interesting side note that historically you actually have plants from two different genera that have been grouped together as Huangqi
Oh.
in history. And a lot of, I know, Greg, you studied Chinese medicine quite a while ago. Probably the edition of Bensky that we used at the time that you were studying, the time that I was originally studying, we learned the names Astragalus and Hediacerum. They would say Astragalus su Hediaceri, meaning either Astragalus or Hediacerum.
Or membranosa.
We very rarely encounter Hediacerum. But the thing that's really interesting is that, like, in my, after I graduated Peking, I moved to Taiwan. Over the last 15 years or so, I've spent about 10 years in Taiwan. And I started doing originally studying in a hospital there, and I've always been really interested in herbal pharmacy. So went to a lot of different herbal pharmacies, and I realized that actually all the neighborhood pharmacies in Taiwan, none of them have Huangqi like we're used to in America. So in America, we tend to mostly either import the herbs directly from China, or we have a lot of herbal medicines imported from Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, they tend to only primarily use Astragalus. And in the US, we tend to pretty much only use Astragalus. But in Taiwan, they very, very rarely use Astragalus as Huangqi. You can get Astragalus made by large granule companies. But if you go, or you could get it if you go specifically to the herbal medicine district, seek out Astragalus versus Hediacerum, then it is possible to buy Astragalus in Taiwan. But if you just go to your local neighborhood herb shop, all of them pretty much universally have Hediacerum and not Astragalus. And Hediacerum has a very similar look to Astragalus. The Chinese Pharmacopoeia grouped them together, both under the name Huangqi until the year 2000. And later they separated them into Huangqi and Hongqi. Hongqi, which would be red Astragalus.
So being a little bit warmer, perhaps?
Because it has a reddish cortex, whereas Huangqi has a more yellowish cortex. But the two of them look very similar, and they have a similar taste, except Hongqi has a slightly sweeter taste. And so Hongqi in Taiwan, a lot of people think Hongqi is the better one if you're making chicken soup. If you're making medicinal food, then Hongqi actually has a better taste. If you're using it for medicine, then a lot of people will say, well, Astragalus has the most extensive amount of clinical use and the most evidence behind it. But actually, when my teacher did some pharmacognosy research where they looked at Huangqi and Hongqi, and they looked at a variety of different effects on the immune system. And both of them had very strong activity, but with slightly different effects. So for anybody who's interested in that paper, we could submit the link, or I could put up the link at my website at legendaryherbs.com. But we've got all of the very nice details about breaking down these two medicinals that were traditionally used interchangeably.
Oh, that'd be great.
So Astragalus is one that also has a bit of an interesting story. And then, of course, you've got others that are very famous and popular right now, like reishi mushroom or goji berry, things that are really hitting a lot of attention. And then we also mentioned some of the things with ginseng. You have some of the other things that are sort of sometimes called ginsengs that aren't actually true ginsengs. A typical case being Siberian Ginseng, Eleutherococcus.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you about that, because that came to some critical acclaim, I think, back in the 70s. Is that, as I remember, with the Soviet Union and the Olympic team using that as an adaptogen, helping their athletes train for longer hours, recover quicker with less effects to the strenuous workouts. I don't know if you recall that, or you did if you came across that in any of your research. But that sort of piqued my interest in the use of Siberian ginseng. Actually, early in my practice, I was using it quite a bit, just as a supplement for people, just kind of to see how it worked, clinically. Do you have any experience with the Siberian ginseng, or?
Yeah, I think that the story of Eleuthero or Siberian ginseng is actually kind of a fundamental piece of this whole adaptogen story. Around the time that people started using the term adaptogen, sort of a substance that kind of has a broad adaptogenic effects. It really started around that time when people were doing a lot of that early research on Siberian ginseng in Soviet Union. A lot of research on Tonics ginseng also in that era. So you have people giving, something like Panax ginseng, giving it to mice and seeing, okay, it improves their ability to adapt to, a hot environment, cold environment, hot environment, cold environment, it improves their ability to prolong their swimming time, prolongs their running time, all it improves their cognitive performance, basically their maze retention, their maze time, all of these things where they're basically giving a substance to the animal, and the animal is generally outperforming their peers on a variety of different parameters.
Right.
So that concept of like adaptogen really started off, really got a lot of traction starting in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And the Chinese medicine take on Siberian Ginseng, on Eleutherococcus sentiecosus, is actually kind of an interesting story. So originally, Chinese medicine only used Chinese names to name the plants. It wasn't really until the early 20th century that they started systematically using Latin names to identify plants and figuring out which Latin botanical names correspond to the traditional Chinese drug names.
Right.
And so that trend really started around 1905 when a doctor named Zhao Yuhuang was one of the first people from a Chinese scholar who went to Japan, studied pharmacognosy. In the late 1800s, pharmacognosy as a Western science became popular. It was brought over from the Dutch, and then the discovery of ephedrine from Ma Huang, led by the Japanese in the late 1800s, led to a huge push towards like pharmacognosy and identifying new drugs from natural compounds and new drugs from traditional medicines. And the person who brought that scientific discipline of pharmacognosy over to China, Zhao Yuhuang, he started off a medical journal, the Qizhou Medical Journal, that started off, first was the main place to systematically use Latin names to try to clarify which botanicals were used. And one of the ones that's an interesting case is the one with Eleutherococcus sentiecosus. So this material, we nowadays in Chinese medicine call it sijia. And sijia is an item that doesn't have a very extensive history in the Bensao literature. Actually, the item that has the more extensive history in the Bensao literature is wujiapi. And wujiapi, we now know it as Acanthopanax grassostylis. Mm-hmm. And its name in the Chinese Pharmacopoeia today specifically just refers to that one species. However, wujiapi historically likely included multiple species within the Acanthopanax genus. And whatever traditional history of use of wujia there was in Chinese medicine was probably largely done under the heading of wujiapi. It wasn't really used as its own herb as a distinct medicine much until the latter part of the 20th century. The Chinese paid attention to the early Russian research that was coming out about Eleutherococcus sentiecosus, and then they realized that they had a lot of natural resources of the same plant in China. It was a new medicinal material that could be developed, and they started looking towards it as a source for like new drug development and then for new medicinal material resource exploitation. So Chinese medicine really didn't start using Siberian ginseng until the modern era, inspired by that same Soviet research that you were inspired by.
Interesting. Yeah. Are there any, would that be considered a banned substance, I wonder, in Olympic, like with the International Olympic Committee these days?
I'm not entirely sure about that, but the main concern with it is that you have several other plants in the Acanthopanax genus. So Eleutherococcus and Acanthopanax, some botanists will call this plant one name or the other. But you have several plants in the Acanthopanax genus that are sold as sijia, that are not the genuine species. And so the main issue with sijia in the Chinese market is an issue of proper identification and using the correctly identified material. Because the name Ci means spiny, and what you see is that a lot of other very spiny materials are sold from the Acanthopanax genus, are sold as sijia. The genuine material actually has very few spines, and it's got somewhat limited natural resources. So historically, the root was used, but over time it's become the root as well as stem. And because the stem is cheaper to grow and sustainably harvest than to dig up the root, most of the material on the market now is stem material rather than root material. And then a lot of the material on the market that's sold as Suijia is not actually the correct species, but these other more spiny acanthopanics. And some of those do appear to have pharmacologic activity, but some of them may also have glycosides and other compounds of concern for safety. So with Suijia, the most important thing is having correctly identified material. I'm not aware of it actually being banned for sports performance, though.
Okay. So we've been talking quite a bit about this class of verbs, the superior class of verbs, and we could go on and on. There are many others, right? I mean, we didn't mention cordyceps, and there's a host of others, and maybe feel free to bring up any others that you're particularly fond of or interested in. But in our traditional Chinese medicine, maybe enhancing performance isn't just giving these, say, adaptogenic type of verbs or superior type of verbs, but we have an entire classification, right, per the Shenong, that and you alluded to this, that stratify different treatment methods that may enhance a person's health, to do various things before you're giving them this type of herb that is specifically promoting physical performance or mental cognitive performance. So maybe can you talk a little bit about that, the strata, like maybe you've got to clear damp, for example, before you get into tonifying or invigorate the blood, like maybe we use sanqi or something like that.
Well, I think that most practitioners of Chinese medicine would generally agree that the ideal therapy for improving any one person's cognitive ability is going to vary depending on their constitution. So overall, the best possible way to go about it would be for a person to see a Chinese medicine practitioner so that they have a clear understanding of what is their constitution like in Chinese medicine. Because somebody who has poor cognitive ability because they suffer from dampness and they don't have clear thinking is going to require a different type of therapy than somebody who has poor cognitive ability because they have blood deficiency and they don't have enough nourishment to the head.
Right.
Two people needed two totally different styles of treatment. And so ultimately there's no substitute for that type of pattern differentiation. That being said, there are some herbal medicines that are, significantly powerful and perceptible. The one that I've personally found to be the most perceptible in terms of something that I would say cognitive function would be Panax ginseng, renshen. And I find that ginseng, when I take it consistently, it makes me think a little bit clearer. It makes me my mood a little bit better. It makes my stamina just a little bit stronger on all these very small ways. I don't feel really particularly more energy, or it's like any sort of short-term boost, like as if I had drinking a cup of coffee. But I noticed that over weeks or over time, I start to just be a little bit, the same Eric, but just a little bit better. All the different tasks to be just a little bit better. And so I think that to me, that's probably one of the things that strikes me as something where there really is some true perceptible cognitive benefit. But that aside, I would say that I would caution us to sort of remember that our understanding of this stuff and the pharmacology is really constantly evolving, because for much of the time in the past, people looked at ginsenosides as the key active ingredients of ginseng. And ginsenosides are saponins that have significant pharmacologic activity. And the different prominence of these different ginsenosides is one of the key differentiating features between closely related herbs like American ginseng xiangshan, Panax ginseng renshen, nodo ginseng sanqi. They all have ginsenosides, but they have them in different ginsenosides in different proportions and different ratios. It's also similar differences between renshen, hong renshen, and bai renshen, the white and the red processed forms. They differ in their ginsenosides that occur, then that occurs due to the steaming, to the changes from the steaming when the root is steamed. But so most of the past research is always focused on ginsenicides. But now they're starting to realize that there's also a lot of polysaccharides in ginseng that may be of interest that weren't being previously investigated. So the polysaccharides tend to be these long chain molecules that are difficult to, in terms of the chemical analysis, it's difficult it's expensive and time consuming to isolate and quantify and characterize these polysaccharides. And because many of the polysaccharides don't enter the bloodstream, a lot of times in the past, a lot of people had dismissed them in terms of being like key markers for the pharmacologic activity of a root like ginseng. But now they're discovering that the ginseng root seems to have effects on the gut microflora. And so it may be that some of these things that previously weren't investigated, and many other tonic herbs like dendrobium, are also very rich in polysaccharides, same with huangqi. So some of these items we may have been overlooking some potentially therapeutic active compounds just by overlooking, not having a clear understanding of the gut microbiota, and not having complex, integrated enough, pharmacological discovery tools to see all the network relationships in these complex systems.
It's interesting that you mentioned the gut biome, and that makes sense when you think about ginseng. You think about the entering meridians, the lung and spleen and stomach, right? What else? Kidney? I'm forgetting, but it makes sense that that would stimulate better thinking, improved health, improved stamina if you relate it to the gut biome. I'm sure there are more systems that it influences as well. I'm surprised, or maybe there is some like pharmaceutical, or have there been pharmaceutical advents from ginseng, or?
Well, there's been a tremendous amount there's been thousands of scientific papers published on ginseng. So in terms of an item there's going to be more research on, cognitive effects and performance enhancing effects on ginseng than almost any other herbal medicine. But it's also interesting to when you look at the Chinese scientific literature, in the West, a lot of people think of something like ginseng as being, okay, this thing gives you energy, and they try to research it like it's a magic bullet, and thinking the thing that will improve cognitive performance or athletic performance is something that will give you energy.
Yeah.
But actually, if you look at a lot of the things that have been researched in China for clinical trials for like cognitive performance on exam performance, a lot of them are actually calming items, things like things based on Tienma Buxindang, Swanzhao, things that are based on like calming the spirit.
Sure.
And that actually makes sense, because you have a lot of, when a person needs peak mental performance for an exam, oftentimes they have already studied, and what they need is to have a calm and focused mental state. So, if they have too much coffee, they could actually perform poorly on the test because they're a little bit too wired.
Yeah, that makes sense.
If they don't have enough coffee, maybe they'll perform poorly.
Yeah, you bring up coffee. We haven't even talked about coffee in this. What do you think about coffee anyway in this? I mean, it's an herb.
Well, I think coffee is definitely a botanical substance with a long cultural history of use in clear pharmacology. I'm a big fan of a really delicious cappuccino myself. So
yeah, different effect from Renshen or
to me it's totally different effect. Yeah, I find very little in the way of like a short-term increase of energy in Renshen. What I find when I take Renshen is that I feel a little bit more, my energy is a little bit more sustained.
Yeah, you don't have the peak and valley.
I don't necessarily, like when I drink a cup of coffee, I notice the change in energy right away.
Sure.
When I take ginseng, it's more that if I take it consistently over a couple of weeks, I start thinking, I feel different now than I did a few weeks ago.
Yeah. I think it's really important to reiterate what you were saying about, the person's nature, because I think a lot of our listeners and just people I know in general, they're equating, herbs for performance to stimulants like caffeine that you would get from coffee or tea. So what you said earlier is really important, and I think that that people need to really understand that and to have guidance around it. I mean, I know you and I both see patients that come in with sacks and lists of things that they're taking to kind of try and find the right therapeutic hum from all these different vitamins or minerals and supplements, and I think that's more of a kind of a Western herbalist approach to things too, right? Which we haven't really talked about, the differences in the kind of Eastern approach to the Western approach. So maybe talk a little bit about that. That's kind of a beautiful thing, how the Chinese medicine works compared to like Western prescribing of herbs.
Well, Chinese medicine is pretty much always dependent on polypharmacy. So Chinese medicine almost always using multiple substances together in a formula often customized for each individual patient. With Western herbal medicine, you would say Western herbal medicine today has largely grown out of modern science and pharmacognosy. And so if we think about historically how Chinese medicine evolved, the style of diagnosis and the use of herbal medicines based on classical formulas, nature, taste, traditional Chinese medicine actions, and traditional relationships with other herbal medicines, that fundamental paradigm is largely unchanged over the last several thousand years. Yeah. It's sort of been continually refined, continually expanded, and it's continually evolved. But a lot of the same fundamental principles that guide Chinese medicine today were established almost 2,000 years ago. And the situation with Western herbal medicine is a little bit different, because Western herbal medicine historically also had things like tastes and properties. They would describe, an herb as being warm to the 3rd degree, or they would describe the nature. They would use the taste of herbs to be correlated with properties. So there was actually a history in Western herbal medicine of viewing herbs based on temperature, flavor. Mm-hmm. But over time, like Western herbal medicine, the challenge with Western herbal medicine was that it lost its continuity. Initially, you had an early period of time when Dioscorides and some of the fundamental works were created. But then, when we mentioned before, you had this Dark Ages when herbal medicine largely, fell out of further development until the Renaissance period. Mm-hmm. And then in the 1800s, you had, as pharmacognosy developed as a science, here you're starting to have like the integration of botany, mm-hmm. where you have botany emerging as a science. You have the discipline of chemistry emerging. You have the integration of these different sciences together with medicine. And one of the first big innovations there around, in the very early 1800s was the isolation of morphine from the opium poppy. And so the opium poppy had a long history of use worldwide, in Europe, across the Middle East, all the way over to China, India. You had a long history of use of poppy as a painkiller. But it wasn't until they were able to isolate morphine from it and make basically the first pure alkaloid to be isolated from a natural material. That sort of started off. You had this time as they were distilling alcohol and trying to you had this quest to find like the spiritual essence of it, right? And that's why we call alcohol spirits, right? That was part of this quest to separate like the refined from the crude and the base in nature. And so the idea that you could find a single molecule that would have the effect of the whole, it was a huge advancement in early chemistry. And in the early 1800s, they isolated many of the famous early alkaloids. So you had things like atropine from datura, you had in henbane, you had things like nicotine from tobacco. You had all of these famous single compounds started to become isolated. Mm-hmm. And medicine gradually moved from being like, you had something like aconite, where aconite had a long history of use in Western herbal medicine. But aconite, for much of its early history, was only regarded as poison. It was only once they started using it in really, really extremely controlled dosages that they started using it as a medicine. But rather than in China, aconite had been used as a medicine since early period of time. But in China, they basically applied the same type of principles of cooking to the preparation of medicinal substances. And they discovered that using heat would greatly reduce the toxicity of aconite. And so by preparation methods, or what they call baozhi in Chinese medicine, they were able to control the toxicity of aconite enough that it was able to be used internally and develop as an internal medicine from an early time period in Chinese medicine. Aconite didn't start to become used internally in the Western medicine until like really in 1700s. And it was used in extremely small doses. And so when you had this natural variable potency of the natural material, which really, if you look at something like datura, or you look at something like aconite, they're very classic representative examples of a highly potent substance in nature that in its natural plant source is very variable, very toxic, very dangerous, with a very narrow therapeutic range.
Yeah.
And so being able to isolate something that can be measured and administered in a very pure form that has that medicinal effect without that variability and that other noise within the plant, it was regarded as very desirable. But I'd say that maybe Western medicine has gone just one step too far. Like if we looked at, the previous editions of the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, 100 years ago, the U.S. Pharmacopoeia was full of plant-based medicines.
Right.
But as synthetic medicines evolved, there became less emphasis on plant-based medicines. And now I think science is sort of coming full circle, starting to have more sophisticated methodology and tools and techniques and equipment to measure these complex multi-component medicines and complex biological systems. I think that we're gradually going to start moving back to having much more of a focus on whole plants, natural products, and new drug development in Western medicine is going to start to come back more towards its herbal roots, I'd say.
Well, that would be incredible. I think as you're talking, I'm thinking about the standardization of medicinals that are coming out of Japan these days, and how they've really, taken that standardization to the next level. I guess they don't look for every component of the plant, though. They're looking for just particular components and standardizing based on that. Is that your understanding of what they're doing over there?
Well, I would say worldwide, both in China as well as Japan, one of the things that they're really starting to focus on is what they would consider to be like the complex fingerprint.
Yeah.
And so in the past, it's you have hundreds of different compounds within even sometimes a single given herb. And then when you have multiple herbs cooked together in a formula, the chemistry becomes extremely complex.
Mm-hmm.
You have a very difficult challenge for like quality control. For example, for compo medicine, where you have multi-herb prescriptions
Mm-hmm.
that are being you can have a sort of a minimum. You can look at multiple different marker compounds and say, okay, we want to control for a minimum amount of these marker compounds to verify that the correct herbs were used and that they were used in a sufficient quantity.
Yeah.
But the overall therapeutic efficacy of that formula, the degree to which it's actually correlated to those marker compounds, is often understudied, right?
Yeah.
Or unknown.
Yeah.
Because when we look at which things, if you're trying to do quality control testing, one of the first things you need to do is verify
Mm-hmm.
that this is the correct medicinal used. And so
Right.
you're looking at which compounds in a plant are unique, are distinct, are abundant. But some of the things, like, for example, the Chinese Pharmacopoeia control for chuanxiong, it tests for a compound that's not unique to chuanxiong, but is abundant in chuanxiong.
Oh.
Chuanxiong has a far more unique and highly potent therapeutic marker compound, but it's not economical to test for it. because it occurs in such a small quantity that you don't have enough of it available as like a pure analytical reference standard to compare it to. So part of the limitation of what companies can test for is dependent on what library of reference materials they have available. And so if you wanted to try to understand, like let's say you grew a Chinese herb and some chaihu in your backyard, and you wanted to understand like its entire chemical profile, you may find like commercially available, there's only a few individual psychosaponins that you could really, that are commercially available as reference materials that you could use with HPLC and quantify the levels of those particular compounds. So you have, in any given chromatograph, the fingerprint of a plant, you're going to have a huge number of different peaks and compounds. And only know the identity of a certain number of those peaks. And so now you're starting to have more profound testing ability. You're starting to have much more stronger ability to do comprehensive quality control. So using some of these things like QTOF mass, they're able to build a complex fingerprint of a given herb. And so they'll take many different batches of Huanglian and feed the computer data of Huanglian samples grown from different parts of China in different regions. And over time, the computer can start to recognize patterns that can even help to clarify, okay, which production region did this Huanglian come from? So not only is it Coptis chinensis, this is a particular species, but even what part of China was it grown? That's starting to be like the new frontier of complex fingerprinting.
Yeah, that's amazing. And then they can pair that with therapeutic effects, I guess, presumably with different hospitals or clinics in the region, and determine, which products are best suited for which things, I would imagine.
Right. And well, yeah, and it's also going to be very useful for in the future for formula standards, because with formulas you're trying to figure out, you have such a complex matrix of chemicals. You want to figure out, like when you're doing the identity testing or quality control testing for a single herb extract, it's a little bit more straightforward to have a validated methodology. But when you're dealing with really complex formulas, then having that really complex fingerprinting becomes a really profound tool.
And it's expensive. The tools you mentioned, the HPLC and the TLC, those are expensive processes too, to do that with every single herb. I mean, isn't that pretty pricey?
Well, you're definitely going to be spending a few $100s per test if you had to do it at an outside lab, or just if you had to fund your own lab. But it's pretty routine within Chinese medicine quality control testing to do HPLC and thin layer chromatography. So a lot of in the 2015 Chinese Pharmacopoeia, you have well over 100 items that have HPLC constituent minimum requirements, and then you have many items that have thin layer chromatography requirements. So basically, you find that like for like a large granule company, every single product is getting thin layer chromatography, and HPLC is routine part of their testing. But the part that's the more routine and actually comparatively cheap part of it. The part that's the more advanced and the more expensive is this next generation complex multi-fingerprint testing, which is so far mostly used for research rather than routine quality control.
I guess I had that as a question for you. It's under identification, like how do we know what we're getting anymore? But I think this is answering the question. I mean, you have obviously the age-old, go to the field, look at it, pull it out of the ground, and if it looks like what you think it looks like, or you can match that with pictures or things like that. But that's one way. But then really looking at the different scientific, like the HPLC, TLC, and the multi-layer, that's really how we know, right?
Yeah, and I think I believe you might have had some experience visiting herbal factories. So you've got a little bit of an exposure to how much more advanced the situation is over in Asia when it comes to the plant extracts than it is in the States. So you basically have like a multi-step when it comes to basic identity testing. If we think about herbal authentication, you basically sort of have a flow chart where it really begins in the Benzal literature, in the historical texts, which plant was the authentic material. And then you have the botanical identification where, in terms of taxonomy, from a person seeing the live flowering plant,
right,
what species is it? And then you have, because you could have the same species of plant that produces, having the right species alone is not sufficient, right? You
Right.
also need to have the correct plant part.
Right.
And you also have to have the correct quality. And so like thin layer chromatography testing is extensive. So you have like macroscopic, using the naked senses, looking at it, looking at the fractured surface, smelling it, tasting it. This is like the traditional method of identifying. And Chinese medicine evolved a very sophisticated approach to naked sense organoleptic discrimination. So with enough experience and a good intact specimens of herbs, a well-trained person can identify a tremendous amount about the quality, origin, botanical identity of a Chinese medicine.
Yeah.
But to be more definitive, or especially for like an herbal company where you need to meet GMP requirements, you're going to have to demonstrate that every identification test in the Chinese Pharmacopoeia was completed. And so the macroscopic and botanical identification is only one part of that. The next step is the microscopy, and then thin layer chromatography and HPLC. So you're usually going to be using that basic range of tests on most incoming herbal medicines that need to be identified. Then you're also going to be doing other quality control testing for things like heavy metals, constituents, pesticides, all that other stuff.
Molds, bugs. Bugs die in the cooking process. People are so freaked out about bugs. It's like, it's a little bit of protein. Yeah, I mean, considering that the average person who consumes herbs, or patients, or even practitioners, we're not really trained to go out in the field. I wasn't trained to go out in the field and recognize whatever chuanzhong or anything else for that matter. I mean, I can recognize dangshen because it grows around here, kind of, or one thing. But most of the times people just buy it. Like I buy my herbs from you. They come in a bottle. They're granules. So what should people be looking for when they're looking for a reputable company? Like, what does Legendary provide for people, or what should I be looking for when I'm purchasing herbs?
Well, I think when it comes to purchasing from herbs, I think the first thing to be aware of is that we're lucky to have a really good supply chain in the States. So we have a very good range of companies to choose from. We have several people that are doing raw herbs with very good quality control, very good identification and testing. And so we have like a relatively small number of suppliers that are, I would say, really top tier suppliers. But of the ones that really are top tier suppliers, we have some really great choices. So I think that there's, with granules, one of the things to be aware of is that granules, there's only a relatively finite number of top tier factories in the world that make these types of products.
Right.
So of the main companies that are in the US, most of them are distributing products from this same relatively short list of top tier factories in Taiwan and mainland China.
Yeah.
And so you tend to have a relatively, among these good factories, the basics of identity testing, safety, quality control, all of that stuff is actually extremely well controlled. When you're getting into more of the, going into some of the really traditional Chinatown style shops, then you start to have to be aware of more issues of regional customary substitutes and easily confused Chinese medicine. So if you were to go to the average Chinatown pharmacy pretty much anywhere in the US, of the 400 herbs or so that you commonly use, there's about 24 or so that you want to be aware of certain issues of identification or quality discernment. So there are a few things to be aware of. I've got a couple articles on the issue of herbal identification.
Yeah, that would be great. We're definitely going to link to your website too for more in-depth information about a lot of the topics that we've been discussing today. I do want to point out that I think it's really important to mention what you just said about like going into Chinese herb stores, and oftentimes they have little boxes of the patent medicines that sometimes can be mixed with pharmaceutical substances. Is that still true?
I think that, well, it's definitely true that that's historically been a significant problem. It's the degree to which it's prevalent, I would say it definitely exists. For me personally, I would tend not to use a lot of those
patents.
small,
Yeah.
inexpensive patent medicines. I would tend to go more from the core main suppliers, just because you're, in addition to the question of like quality and safety,
Yeah.
you also need to have a good bang for your buck from, make sure that the money that you're putting towards the medicine is going to give you a good, significant therapeutic effect. And so I think that raw herbs and granules are the best delivery forms in terms of giving you the value per potency.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about the sources and where they're grown, and the sustainability of herbal medicine. I mean, when I was in China, I was awestruck by the amount of herbs that were going out. Meaning, I looked at the warehouse at Tianjin, and it was, you've seen it. It's 400 yards long and 4 stories high, and that's like 3 months supply of granules that was moving out to, how sustainable how sustainable is it, with the demand just in China alone of the Chinese herbs. And now, there's a big movement with the Chinese government. We both know they've got these decade plans of, moving medicine westward, if you will, these cultural plans to really, disseminate Chinese medicine and get it out there into the world beyond the borders of Asia and Southeast Asia. How sustainable is that? With the wildcraft, it is only so much, and then the farms can. Do you know? I mean, is this something that we should be concerned about as an industry?
I think the issue of natural resources is one of the fundamentally, and ecology is a fundamental issue for Chinese medicine. Of the herbs that we commonly use in Chinese medicine, about 150 to 200 of them are primarily cultivated in origin. And so you have most of the items where there's really a large amount of clinical use. In most cases, those are primarily coming from cultivated sources. And so just simply to meet the market requirement. And in some situations, actually more consumption creates more production. And so you have some items where, ecologically, it's a very good situation. Like, for example, I've been to like gotung farms in Guangxi province, where they're just growing the gotung all over the mountainside, just growing it in a half-wild environment.
Oh, nice.
Gotung is naturally occurs in the wild environment there, but it's not really economically. In the past, throughout most of the history of Chinese medicine, there was enough gotung that people could just collect it from the wild. And because they're just collecting the aerial part of it, the plant would stay alive and continue to grow back. But as time goes on, the amount that gotung is not worth enough for somebody to go into the forest, into the field to collect it. It's much more efficient for them to cultivate it. But because it's cultivated, and because it grows naturally well in that environment, they can grow it in the wild environment and just cover entire mountainsides with it. And there is a very sustainable approach to cultivation that doesn't really have any particular negative impact. In other cases, you have some herbs where you have very high intensity of cultivation requirement. So something like sanqi, nodo ginseng, is basically extinct from the wild. There's not a known live plant of nodo ginseng in the wild. As far as we know, the plant is already virtually extinct outside of cultivation.
So where are they growing that?
They primarily grow it in Yunnan, in Wenshan County. And so the traditional name of sanqi, one of its names is Tianqi, because it came from a region called Tianzhou in Guangxi, near the border of Yunnan. And so basically, like along that border between Yunnan and Guangxi province has been the traditional region where it's grown. But most of the sanqi is grown in a county called Wenshan County in Yunnan.
Okay.
And the challenge with sanqi is that it requires a relatively long time for the field to recover after a crop has been grown. So after growing sanqi, they can't grow sanqi in the same location for about 35 years. So they have to constantly rotate the land that's being cultivated. And so they're starting to gradually run out of premium land to cultivate it. But as they grow it in other parts of Yunnan closer to Kunming, they find that it's difficult to achieve the same quality that they get in Wenshan. And so for an herb like sanxi, we're heavily dependent on its cultivation. But its cultivation environment may be in the future running into some finite limits unless people can learn how to grow it and adapt it well to other places. But this has already been successfully achieved with other herbs that were once thought impossible. So something like Tienma was critically endangered in the 70s, and the entire Chinese medicine market was full of counterfeits of all different things like dried potatoes and everything sold as Tienma. But nowadays, acquiring genuine Tienma is not a problem at all, because Tienma is extensively grown. They just needed to learn how to pair it with a symbiotic. It needs a symbiotic fungus in order to absorb nutrients. So once they learned how to pair it with this fungal partner, then they were able to successfully grow it. And the same is true with something like dendrobium orchids for Zhihu. Traditionally, they were very difficult to cultivate, but now that they've got a cell culture and they're able to grow them in a lab from cell culture, then they're able to grow juvenile plants in a lab and then move them to a natural, like a wood chip type of medium, and then sell them to farmers to grow them out and then buy them back. So they're able to make these very well vertically integrated supply chains for some of these medicines that in some ways is actually, you could say, having a positive ecological benefit, causing causing economic benefits in some of these rural areas, and actually causing more of the plant to be cultivated. So
I often get questions, and I'm sure you get this question all the time too, about the use of pesticides in China and the quest for organic. What do you say to your customers or to people that are concerned about the use of insecticides or pesticides, these types of things in China? And is that as big of an issue as the concern that we hear?
Well, it's definitely an issue. I think you have certain sometimes it can be a little bit maybe exaggerated in the public imagination as to compared to the real situation, but it's definitely a major concern for certain Chinese medicines. So for some items like ginseng, nodo ginseng, chrysanthemum, goji berry, for certain items you do have problems with excessive pesticide use. Most of the items where you have problems with pesticides, you also have solutions. So you have good agricultural practice farms for nodo ginseng, you have GAP farms for renshen, you have organic farms for renshen, you have organic farms for wuizi, you have GAP, you have low pesticide material, you have a lot of a wide range of products that are available on the market. Okay. And so I think that the biggest problem tends to be from, let's say you have a lot of the best material on the market is being consumed by large, well-managed companies. So most of the large, well-managed companies, they have the equipment to do pesticide testing. They have the capability to buy direct from farms, the capability to test in the soil. Some of the companies even have sort of a vertical management from the seed and seedling and soil conditions, controlling the SOPs for the entire cultivation of the plant from start to finish. And so that type of ideal model is the way that the field is gradually evolving. The problem is that you have all these small family farms that as we have a huge demand for more clear supply chains, more standardized links, more thorough, in order to basically have the most control over pesticides, you really need to have control from the farm level.
Right.
And you need to have where the company that's buying the material is accepting some of the risk from the farmer and investing in the production of the herb. And so many of the small family farms, like you take an herb like baishao, it's grown really extensively in the area around Bozhou, China. We have hundreds and hundreds of small family farms, each growing one very small plot of it. and then it gets harvested, collected, mixed together, and graded based on its morphological features into different quality grades. But because it's coming from multiple farms and it's being mixed together, it's much easier for that material. Like if you had one farmer that was growing without pesticides, another that was growing with them, that material can be mixed together. So for the companies that are trying to really avoid pesticides, it's best for them to control it from the farm level. The challenge is that it's gradually going to cause all of those small family farmers, many of whom have done things organically for generations, gradually it's going to become progressively more difficult for them to compete in a world that favors large producers, standardized links, and strictly controlled supply chains. So there's kind of a good and a bad side both to the way the herbal medicine world is evolving. My teacher did a relatively extensive project with Harvard in the past. And they did they collected samples of commonly used Chinese medicines using GPS tracking, collecting both wild and cultivated materials, and did a really extensive paper looking at pesticide residues and heavy metals.
Interesting.
And they found that about 2/3 of the Chinese medicines that they tested overall had no detectable pesticides. And then I'd have to look at the exact statistics, but I think it was something like of the 35% or some that had some detectable ones, you had a very small percentage that was above the limit. Right? And then some that you have detection, but below, but within what would be considered like a safe limit in the EU or something. And so I would say it's generally not difficult to find. There is adequate supply of Chinese herbs that meet the requirements for like the EU for pesticides and stuff, but you do have to seek out quality sources.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned that most of the main suppliers, for example, where you and I both get our herbs, they have a level of certification from the Chinese government that's, the top layer of certification for an industry is the military. The second tier, I think, down is for hospitals and medicinal companies like herbal suppliers and things like that. So for example, the place where we get our herbs have the highest level of certification. So I feel confident that what we get is really high quality, and eyes are really on that. And I know that our FDA goes over there and visits and actually walks through the same plant that you and I walk through to look at our quality control. So, but I just wanted to ask you that from your experience, because I get that question quite often.
Yeah, and oftentimes what you'll find is that you have pesticide testing that's done at the raw material acquisition stage, because it's much cheaper for them to test the herbs that they're considering buying before they've already bought several tons of them.
Right.
So you have a key element of pesticide testing having that original raw material screening stage. And you also have pesticide testing that's done by the factories on finished products, but you also have pesticide testing done by, like, for example, European distributors. So often, because in Europe, a lot of the items that are included in the European Pharmacopoeia, they're required to be retested within Europe to demonstrate identity and then pesticide residues. And so oftentimes we feel lucky that we're able to buy a lot of the same batches that are then being independently tested in Europe for a broad spectrum of pesticides. So you not only have the factory testing, but you also have a tier of independent testing going on too.
Oh, do we do that in the States?
You can, basically there's there's labs that have independent testing in the States. So,
but we don't do that. We don't do that before import, though, right? You're saying they do that in Europe before import? In
Europe, it's a requirement. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. The U.S. law around pesticides is actually a little bit challenging, because the U.S. law sets pesticide requirements. They're all crop specific. And so, for example, like the amount of pesticide that's present in cherries of a given pesticide could be different than the amount that's permissible in, say, apples.
Yeah.
And then so you could have one pesticide it's allowed to be used in cherries, it's allowed to be used in apples, but because there's no official standard for weights, you can't have any detectable pesticides. So.
Crazy. So let's shift gears a little bit. We've been talking a lot about the historical context and the quality. What about modern research? What is modern? You alluded to the research that's been done on ginseng, and what is modern research telling us about herbs and in general, and specifically related to peak performance, which is, we kind of got off track with that. But what are you aware of in the modern research about any particular herbs or in general about peak performance and the use of herbal medicine?
Well, my area of expertise mostly towards the traditional materia medica and quality discernment. So exactly in the area of peak performance has never been my core specialty, but if you think about the sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. We'll move on. Let's scratch that one.
Yeah. We're getting also about an hour and a half in now.
Okay. Last question, and then we'll wrap. How cautious should people be when they're taking herbs, when they're taking medicine? We in clinical practice, we are concerned about herb-drug interactions. So, one, are there good resources for people? What should people do before they take herbs? I guess is my question for you.
Well, I think the issue with herb-drug interactions is one of those things where it really requires like a critical assessment of the evidence, because right now what's happening is you have a lot of interest in the topic of herb-drug interactions, but you have only a relatively small number of cases where there's a really well-documented interaction in the literature. And so you have a lot of things where people have these put forward hypothetical interactions or hypothetical scenarios, or they haven't filtered the evidence based on how strong the evidence is for the suspected interaction. So a lot of people are afraid that they'll give the doctor will give the patient a laundry list of different dangers of using herbal medicine. But oftentimes there's very little selection of like really what is the true risk of these adverse events coming about. Mm-hmm. Typical example that I remember when I was in Taiwan, we had some researchers from the NIH had come over looking to build a drug interaction database with Chinese medicines.
Okay.
And we started to mine the available Chinese data. And you have in China many reports that were previously done on paper records within individual hospitals that are now all starting to be digitized and shared. So as China's gradually moving more towards electronic medical record keeping, this type of the big data that you're going to start seeing from electronic medical record keeping may clarify a lot of things that we didn't previously that we weren't previously aware of. And in some cases that may well also say a lot about the safety of Chinese medicine as well as the dangers. So
right.
A typical example of that, like if you look at the electronic medical records of Taiwan, you have about 30 million patient visits per year using Chinese medicine. Mm-hmm. And so you have a tremendous amount all being done within an integrated electronic medical record system. So you can sort the data and figure out, okay, how many patients with allergic rhinitis were taking this formula, mm-hmm. or we're taking a single herb modification A, B, and C. Mm-hmm. And you can look at the total prescribing data by licensed practitioners. And you could say something like ephedra, which was banned in the U.S. for foods and dietary supplements,
right,
due to concerns over its safety. But if you look at how ephedra is actually prescribed in Chinese medicine, they're not utilizing it for weight loss. They're not utilizing it for athletic performance. They're often, using it based on its traditional indications. You have about 4,000 doctors prescribing in the Taiwan medical system, and you have a correlation of adverse events reported. So you can tell that like 3 of the top 10 formulas by volume in Taiwan contain ephedra. Huh. But the number of adverse events reported in Taiwan through nurses, through hospitals, through media reports, through Chinese medicine doctors, through Western medicine doctors. The number of total adverse event reports that make it into they have a centralized database where they investigate each report that's been filed or appears in the media. And you can correlate the number of actual adverse incidents to the amount of doses prescribed. And actually the data suggests that it's quite safe when used correctly by well-trained practitioners. So I think that that's going to be the big future for clarifying some of these issues of safety, herb-drug interactions is going to be as Chinese medicine moves into much more of this big data, and we'll be able to start to really systematically move from beyond like isolated individual case reports where there's a lot of variables and a lot of hypotheticals about herb-drug interactions to having much more solid data to go from.
That would be great. It would be awesome to get Ma Huang and Xixin back in the clinic, wouldn't it? Yeah. Well, Eric, I know we've gone for quite some time talking, and you're just an encyclopedic knowledge base of something that's very fascinating. And I know I want to learn more and continue to learn more, and many of our listeners will want to learn more. So your website is legendaryherbs.com, right?
Yes, it is.
www.legendaryherbs.com, and you have articles and
I've got
research.
A lot of articles and blogs and
blogs. So wonderful resource. And I just want to thank you so much, for spending some time with us today and enlightening us. And I really look forward to seeing you back here in San Diego at some point soon.
Well, thank you, Greg. I look forward to doing more with you guys and more with Pico.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Okay, take care.